So the GPT store has just gone live, and you might be wondering how you can connect your own API to a custom GPT. Well, the good news is you can do that with a feature called Actions. Let me show you an example. So I've built this custom GPT called Live Flight Data. So when I ask the GPT a question, it's going to call my API to get the latest information about the flight that I'm asking about. If I call my API, then this is the JSON response that we receive. It's a JSON object filled with information about that flight. Our GPT can now use this information from our API and respond with a more natural response. In this video, I'm going to show you how I made this example so that you can connect your own API to your custom GPT. So to begin with, we first need to create our custom GPT. And so to do that, we can just go to chat.openai.com/gpts/mine so that you can see a list of all of your GPTs. And I can see at the moment that I've got this finished one that we've been using as a test here, but what we're going to do is create a brand new one from scratch. So we're going to click on create a GPT. So I've just filled in some initial information here in the configure tab. So I've set the name to the get flight details GPT. I've set the description to ask any question about a flight number and receive a real-time answer. I've also provided some basic instructions just for our GPT, just so that it stays on track, which is basically to provide accurate and up-to-date information about flights, including flight status, scheduled and related details. And then finally, I've just added some conversation starters. So we've got when is flight VS3 estimated to land today, and was BA1316 delayed. Next up, we need to look at this capabilities section. So our GPT definitely does not require the need to generate any images because we're just going to be providing flight data. Next, there's another option here called web browsing. This will effectively allow our GPT to be able to navigate the web and find information out for itself. Now, in a lot of situations, that's going to be really useful for your GPT, but for this example, we actually just want to limit it to using the tool that we've created. So for now, I'm actually going to disable the web browsing. Next, we want to start connecting our API to this GPT, and to do that, we can just scroll down to this actions section here and click on create new action. In this section of the setup, we've got a few different fields. So we've got this authentication field, we've got the schema field, and we've got a privacy policy field. So for now, we actually need to do a little bit of work to build our API before we can fill in any of these pieces of information. So we're just going to go up to the top right here, click on save, and then I'm just going to publish to only me, just so that I've saved the latest version of our GPT, and then we're going to start building our API. So in this tutorial, we're going to be using TypeScript and Node to set up our API. However, if you know how to build an API already using other technologies, then feel free to use those. So there are two things that we need our API to do. We need to provide our GPT with a URL that it can reach out to get this flight information. When our GPT makes a request to that endpoint, we want to serve up a JSON object containing all the information about the flight that was requested. We're also going to need to protect that endpoint using an API key to make sure that our GPT is the only thing that can access it. And so using Nitro, TypeScript, and Node, I'm going to show you how we can set that up now. So to create a project, we just need to go to our terminal and type in the following command, which is npx get at latest nitro gpt test API. This last section here, GPT test API, that's going to be the name of our project. And then we can just hit enter. Next, what I'm going to do is cd into that directory that we've just created. So I'm going to go cd gpt test API and hit enter. Next, I need to install all the required dependencies. So I'm going to type in npm install and hit enter. And now that I've got everything installed, I just want to test to make sure everything's working. So I'm just going to run npm run dev. And it looks like the Nitro has successfully built. So I'm just going to go to localhost 3000, and we can see that we've got a JSON response here, which is just Nitro is awesome. So next what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up this GPT test API directory that I've just created in my Visual Studio Code editor. If we click on the roots directory and then click on index, we can see that we export a handler from this file, which returns an object which contains the key Nitro, and the string is awesome. And if we head back over to our browser, we can see that this is the response that's served up from our home directory. So using the same methodology, we're going to create an endpoint which our GPT can reach out to get the latest flight information. And so to do that, we're just going to right click on roots. We're going to create ourselves a new folder, and we're going to type in flights. Inside that folder, we're going to create a new file, and we're going to call it flight number wrapped in square brackets .ts, which is a TypeScript file. Next, let's also export a really basic event handler just to make sure that this route is working. So we're going to go export default event handler and pass in an asynchronous function here, which is just going to return an object which is hello world. And so if I now head back over to our browser and just go /flights/vs3, which is going to be the name of the flight that we're going to be testing with, I can now see that we get the hello world response, which is exactly what we expected. Next, what we need to do is perform an API request to a different API to get our flight information from. And to get that, we are going to need this section of our URL here, which is going to be our flight number. To get that parameter from the URL, we're going to extract the params object from the event.context. Next, we're going to grab our flight number from these parameters and cache it into a variable called flight number. And then finally, just as a test, we're going to return a JSON object, which is going to have the key flight number and the value of the flight number that was passed in. So if I now head back to our Chrome instance and then hit refresh, we can now see that our server is responding correctly with a JSON object which has the key flight number and the value vs3, where vs3 is the parameter that we passed in using our URL up here. Now that our API is aware of which flight number our GPT is asking about, we now need to get that live information from a flight-based API. To do that, I'm going to be using a free API called AviationStack. If I actually scroll down, we can actually test it out. And if I type in vs3 just here and search for flight, we can see all of this helpful information about the Virgin Atlantic flight vs3. Now, this is a snapshot of all of the information that we want to give to our GPT to be able to answer those questions accurately. So to get this live information from AviationStack, we're going to need to get an API key. To get that, you can just sign up to AviationStack for free, and then once you've signed up, you'll be able to get access to your API key from the dashboard. Here you can see what your dashboard will look like after you've been logged in. You can see your API key is just on display here, so we're just going to copy that. I will be resetting this API key before this goes live, so you'll need to use your own API key. And then I'm just going to copy this API key. Next, I'm going to head back over to our Visual Studio instance, and I'm going to create a new file in the root directory, and I'm going to call it .env. Next, I just need to fill the .env file with a single key, which is AviationStack API key. And then I'm going to set that environment variable to a string, and I'm going to paste in that API key that we just copied from our AviationStack dashboard. Next, I want to get information from AviationStack about the flight number that we are querying. And so to do that, I'm going to call await fetch, and then I'm going to pass in a single string, which is going to be the URL, which is api.aviationstack.com/v1/flights. And then we're going to pass in a parameter access key, and we're going to pass in the environment variable that we just set, which is the AviationStack API key. And then we're going to pass another parameter, which is flight_IATA, equals, and we're going to pass in the flight number variable, which we actually got a few steps ago, which we picked from our URL's parameters. Next, we expect the response from AviationStack to be a JSON object. And so what we can do is we can just create a new variable called JSON, and we're going to call awaitResult.json, which is a function. Next, from that JSON object, we can grab the latest flight data for the requested flight number by going JSON.data and then grabbing the first item in the array. And finally, we're just going to return an object which contains the key flight data with all of the flight data that we fetched from AviationStack. And so we're just about ready to test, but because we've made some changes to our environment variables, we're going to need to restart our server first. And so to do that, I'm just going to head back to my terminal. I'm going to go Control-C, and then I'm going to go npm run dev once again. Now I'm going to head back to Chrome and go back to the URL that we were querying earlier, which is localhost 3000/flights/vs3, where vs3 is the flight number that we want to query. I'm just going to hit refresh. And now we can see that we have a JSON response which has the key flight data, followed by an object which is filled with flight information about that flight. Next, we want to add a layer of authorization to our API to make sure that only our custom GPT can access our API. So before we do that, I'm just going to get rid of this index.ts file because we don't need it. So I'm just going to right click it and click on delete and just move that to the trash. Next, I'm going to create a new directory in the root, and I'm going to call it middleware. And then I'm going to create a new file inside of that, and I'm going to call it auth.ts. Next, I'm going to define an event handler. Now, this is going to be run every single time a request is made to our server, which is basically going to validate our request to make sure that they are authorized. And so to do that, I'm just going to go export default define event handler, and once again, pass in a Lambda function, which is going to have the parameter event. First, we're going to grab the authorization header from the request. And so to do that, we're just going to go const authorization header event.headers.get, and then pass in the string authorization. Next, we need to check to make sure an authorization header was provided, and if not, then we need to return an error. And so to do that, we're going to go, if there is no authorization header, we're going to call the setResponseStatus function. We're going to pass in the event, and we're going to set the status to 401, which is unauthorized. Next, we're going to return an object which is going to have a single key, which says error, and we're going to pass the string no authorization header provided. From here on out, we're going to need to modify our request in ways that we aren't going to be able to easily inside of Google Chrome. And so to be able to make those requests, we're going to use a tool called Insomnia. Once we've got Insomnia installed, we're just going to go back to this tab and we're going to copy this URL that we've been working on. We'll head over to Insomnia and we'll click on this little plus here and then click on HTTP request. And then we're just going to paste that URL into this field here. Now, if I click send, we get a 401 unauthorized response, which is correct, and we have an error which says no authorization header provided. To satisfy that middleware and get that flight information from our API, we're going to need to set an authorization token. And so to do that, we're just going to click on auth, and then we're going to click on bearer token. For now, I'm just going to pass in any string whatsoever because that should satisfy what we've written so far. So if I type in 1234 and then hit send, we can now see that we're going to get all of our flight data. Now, we've checked to make sure that authorization header exists. What we now need to do is set up a string on our server side that only our GPT is going to know. This is going to be the API key that secures every one of our requests. So to do that, I'm just going to go back over to our .env file and I'm going to create us a new environment variable. I'm going to call it OpenAI authorization key, and I'm going to set the value to a secure random string. Next, I'm going to copy that secure random string. I'm going to head back to our flight details GPT configuration screen, scroll back down to our actions, and then I'm going to click on create new action. And here's where we can start filling in the first section of our action, which is going to be this authentication section. So I'm going to click on that, and then I'm going to click on API key. I'm going to click on bearer, and then I'm going to paste in that string that I've just copied from our environment variables. And then next, I'm going to click on save. So now what we need to do is to complete our authorization middleware. We just need to compare the incoming header authorization key with the authorization key that's on our server. If they match, then we can just let the API request go through. Otherwise, we're going to throw another error. To get the authorization token from the header, we're going to go const authorization token authorization header dot split by the string bearer with a space, and then we're going to call slice passing in -1 to get the last item in the array, and then we're going to get the first object in the array that returns. And so now that we've got the incoming authorization token, we just need to compare it with the one that's on our server. And so to do that, we can just go if authorization token does not equal process.env.openai authorization key. That is the environment variable that we just set up a second ago. We're going to once again call the set response status function, passing in the event and passing in the status code 401, which is unauthorized. And then finally, we're going to return a JSON object, which has the key error. And this time it has the string authorization headers do not match. Because once again, we've made some changes to our environment variables, we're just going to restart our server by going back to our terminal and going Control-C and then typing in npm run dev once again. Now, if we head back to Insomnia and perform that same request again, this time with the bearer token set to 1234, which is incorrect, we should be able to see that the authorization headers do not match. If I pass it the correct authorization token, however, we should see the correct response. And so to get that, we're just going to go back to our Visual Studio Code instance. We're going to go to our .env file. We're going to copy this OpenAI authorization key, tab back over to Insomnia, and this time we're going to paste it into this token field and hit send one last time. We can now see that this token passes all of the authorization checks and we get a full flight details response. What we've just done is we've configured our GPT to make sure that every single time it makes a request to our API, it's going to pass in that string that we've just provided it. Because that string that we provided to our GPT is going to match the authorization key that we've got on our server, it's going to pass the security check. And so that's our authorization layer set up. Now it's time to deploy the API. Nitro has a ton of different providers it supports, like Amplify, Lambda, Cloudflare. Today we're going to be using Netlify. So to do that, I'm going to go to nitro.config.ts and I'm going to just add a new parameter inside of this object. I'm going to add the key preset and I'm going to set it to Netlify. Next, you'll need to upload your project to a GitHub repository. Now, if you've already got a GitHub account, you should be familiar with how to do that step. But if you haven't done this before, then I'll leave a guide in the description. Once you've uploaded your project to GitHub, you can then head over to Netlify and sign up for a brand new account. Once you've created your account and you're on a page that looks similar to this, you can just click on add new site and then you can click on import from an existing project. Now I've uploaded my project to GitHub, so I'm just going to click on deploy with GitHub and I'm going to select the name of the project where my API is stored, which is GPT Action API. For the configuration on this step, I'm going to be deploying my main branch. I can just scroll down a little bit here. I'll want to set my build command to npm run build, and I'll want to select my publish directory to dist. Finally, I'm going to scroll down a little bit and I'm just going to click on add environment variables, and then I'm going to click on new variable, and then I'm going to need to copy those 2 environment variables from my .env file. So I'll head back over to Visual Studio and open up .env. I'm going to take my AviationStack API key first. So I'll take that key and then I will copy and paste the value. And then I'm going to do the same for the OpenAI authorization key. Finally, after that, I can just hit the deploy GPT action API and my API will be live. After your site has been deployed, you're going to want to head to site configuration on this page, and then you're going to want to scroll down and then just click on change site name. You will likely have a random string here. I've just changed it to GPT action test, but feel free to call it whatever you'd like. After that, click save and then just head back to site overview. Next, once you can see that your production branch has been published, you can just copy the URL here, and then we're going to head back to Insomnia and test it out. So as you can see, I've got my localhost 3000 flights request here. I'm just going to go ahead and replace this URL with the GPT action test.netlify.app URL, which I've just copied and pasted from my Netlify account. Next, I'm going to go ahead and click on the send button, and we can see that my data is returned successfully, which means that our API is now live and can now be used by our custom GPT. Now we just need to head back to our custom GPT's configuration page and scroll down to the bottom and click on this invalid action, which is the one we're currently working on. The only thing that we're missing right now is this schema section, which is going to be the instructions to tell our GPT how our API works. Now we could use one of these selected examples and build our own, but thankfully if we're using Nitro, we can actually just generate one using Nitro. So I'm going to head back over to Visual Studio Code and I'm going to go back to nitro.config.ts. This time I'm going to add a new object inside of our configuration object, and I'm going to call the key experimental, and inside this object I'm going to pass in a parameter OpenAPI and I'm going to set that to true. So next I'm going to head back to our terminal. I'm going to hit Control-C to stop it running, and I'm going to once again call npm run dev. To get hold of that OpenAPI schema, we can just go back to Insomnia and we can just go localhost 3000 _ nitro / openapi.json. And now we can see that we have a JSON response which contains all of the information about our API's roots. So I've just copied and pasted that JSON response into a file called OpenAPI schema.json. What we're going to do now is make a few changes to that file so it's ready for us to upload to our custom GPT. First, we need to change the version from null to 1.0.0. You can call it whatever you want version-wise, but it just needs to be a value that is not null. Next, we need to change our server URL from our development URL into our deployed Netlify URL. And to do that, I'm just going to change the URL value from localhost 3000 into that URL that we copied and pasted from Netlify earlier. I'm also going to change the description of our server from local development server to something a little bit more descriptive for our project, which is going to be a detailed flight information API. We're going to want to use HTTPS and not HTTP, so I'm just going to add an S to the end of here, so we're using the HTTPS scheme. And now we just need to add a little bit more metadata to our flights endpoint so that our GPT knows how to use this endpoint. So inside of the get object, I'm going to add an operation ID, and I'm going to set that to get flight details from flight number. I'm also going to add a description, and I'm going to set that to get details about a flight based on a provided flight number parameter. Now it's important that you provide a description which is descriptive so that OpenAPI knows how to use the parameters and also what the API does. Next, we need to give our GPT a little bit more information about the parameter. So to do that, we're just going to add a new property inside of this parameters object, and we're going to set that to a short description about what this parameter does, which is going to be the flight number. This should be a short series of letters and numbers which defines the flight. Finally, we need to let our GPT know what kind of value this parameter is. And so to do that, we can just create a new object, and it's going to be schema. And then inside of that, we're going to pass in a key type, and we're going to set that to string. Next, what we need to do is just add a little bit more information about our responses. Now, by default, Nitro gives us this 200 response and gives the description OK. Now, we have two other responses, which includes 401, which is an unauthorized response, and 500, which is a server error. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut this piece out, and I'm just going to add three responses, which are 200, 401, and 500, with a little bit more description on each of those responses. Finally, we can just go ahead and remove some of these other endpoints that we don't need. So we can remove the OpenAPI JSON endpoint, and we can also remove the Nitro Swagger endpoint. So I'm just going to select those, delete them, and I'm going to hit save. Now our schema is ready to go. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy that, and I'm going to head back over to our custom GPT configuration page. And I'm going to go ahead and paste it into this schema section here. If everything's gone right, you shouldn't see any errors down here, and you should be able to see the available actions, which includes all the metadata that we've included in our OpenAPI schema. And we can see the path that we configured along with the flight number parameter, which means that everything is working as expected. And so now that everything is configured, I can go ahead and test this out. And so to test it out, I'm going to click on one of these pre-configured prompts here, which is when is flight VS3 estimated to land today. And we can see that we've got a response from GPT Action test.netlify. Flight VS3 operated by Virgin Atlantic has already landed today. It landed at 12:01, even though the scheduled arrival time was 12:15. And so we can now see that our custom GPT is connected to our API. If you enjoyed this video and you'd like to see more videos like this, then please do drop me a comment to let me know. It really helps. And I hope the video was useful, and I will see you in the next one.